Hello, welcome to the online course, What is Open Data Journalism and Why We Need Skills to Search for Data. During the first topic of the course, we will define what is open data journalism and why it is important. We will also find out what is considered as the beginning of data journalism. Then we will examine how data journalism is classified and what roles open data journalists play in today's society. And finally, we will have a look at the challenges that open data journalism is facing and its future perspectives. Open data journalism is the process of reporting facts using structured data as the core of storytelling and managing it objectively. This is the definition of open data journalism. It is also important to emphasize that open data journalism uses open data that is made public by governments or other authorities. Also, open data journalism has three main features. It presents facts objectively based on official statistical data, backed up with numbers. It uses structured data management method. Data is organized and managed by various programs. And it uses open data as a core of storytelling. A story narrative or a visual is always created from data. The importance of data journalism has increased significantly recently. Right now on the screen you can see a pyramid. It is often referred as a knowledge pyramid, wisdom hierarchy, or information hierarchy. The pyramid represents the relationships between data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. The basis for the knowledge pyramid is data. Then goes information, knowledge, and finally wisdom. Each step of the pyramid answers questions about the initial data and adds value to it. The more questions we answer, the higher we move up the pyramid. In other words, the more we enrich our data with meaning and context, the more knowledge and insights we get out of it. At the top of the pyramid, we have turned the knowledge and insights into a learning experience that guides our actions. In order to do so, data is necessary. Therefore, data is the core of this wisdom pyramid. And this pyramid represents the importance of data in our daily lives as well as journalism. Without data, journalists would not have the information what is happening in the world, media users wouldn't have knowledge about it, and the society wouldn't be educated on the news and wouldn't have the wisdom. As we can see, data plays a huge importance while talking about journalism. Data journalists have a tremendous role to play as public service watchdogs. They can transform the flood of publicly available data into insight that facilitates citizen engagement in the democratic process. Data provides journalists with a high level of transparency since the information is backed up by statistics. It also allows to interpret official information independently and unbiasedly. For journalists, data also encourages them to adapt their tools to the digital age, making it more digitally and technologically inclined. Whereas for readers, data makes the context more dynamic, diverse, and interactive. Let's now have a look at how data journalists implement their main task: present the story made out of data. First of all, they gather data. There is a popular belief that data journalists gather only collections of numbers, most likely gathered on a spreadsheet. It was true 20 years ago. Now, in a digital world, almost anything can be and almost everything is described with numbers, and that is all data. Then, data journalists have a task to manage data. This includes filtering data, comparing it, grouping the data according to various tendencies, and so on. After that, data journalists look for interesting factors in the data to make an interesting story. And finally, there comes a final part: storytelling. This may include a narrative describing the data, but most often it is a visual data representation. In this way, Data journalists help readers to better understand complex, sophisticated topics in a shorter amount of time. The visual content they produce from data is easier and faster to articulate, deepening the audience's understanding and improving their chances of remembering the key information. Some people say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that is often true about data journalism. Therefore, the steps how the process of producing a data journalism story look like. First of all, the information is gathered, then the data is filtered, visualized, and the story is presented to its recipients. Let's now have a look at the history of data journalism. When, where, and how did open data journalism start? Apparently, it all began on the 5th of May in 1821. And that was a while ago. The British newspaper The Guardian contained a table of data. It was a list of schools in Manchester and Salford with a number of students attending each one and average annual spending. It told the readers for the very first time how many students received free education and how many students were actually in the city. Today, this kind of article would be very common. Yet, in 1821, it was a true sensation. The data was leaked to The Guardian by a credible source only identified as NH. It showed the difference between the numbers that were publicly announced by the government and the real data. The list that The Guardian printed gave a true picture of the reality for the very first time in the history. The reasons of the secret source NH were as he or she said. At all times, such information it contains is valuable, because without knowing, the best options which can be formed of the condition and future progress of society must be necessarily incorrect. To make it clear, how can things ever get better without knowing the state of society? Thus, data was used to help fighting for a decent education system. Although the motivation to use data journalism has remained the same today, the power of data journalism has expanded. There is a standard definition of open data journalism, as it was mentioned before in this presentation, but when it comes to the actual use of data journalism, there are still a variety of dimensions. In particular, classification is the key factor that makes data journalism exceptional. First of all, open data journalism is classified by function into investigative data journalism and general data journalism. Investigative data journalism is used to do investigative news reports. The aim of this type of data journalism is to expose the peculiarities associated with public interests. It is also often used to search for hidden data when the hidden data is afterwards compared with the official open data. Investigative data journalism is quite complex and requires advanced techniques to analyze data. On the other hand, general data journalism is less complicated. It provides general news coverage, statistics about important issues happening in the world or within the community. Most often, it does not require any advanced techniques besides coding and visualizing data, which is already quite a lot. Secondly, data journalism is classified by the extracted meaning from the data into data journalism that describes characteristics and data journalism that analyzes data relationships. This kind of classification focuses on the interpretation of data, which is an important step that is at the heart of data journalism. Data journalism that describes characteristics aims at processing basic data characteristics using statistics or algorithms that are not very complex. It is usually used for making comparisons between different values, finding the average of data values, and so on. Whereas data journalism that analyzes data relationships aims at the processing of data links and needs to use statistics or algorithms related to the act of finding data relationships which are more complex than data journalism that describes characteristics. It is used to analyze complex structure and categorize the relationships. Finally, open data journalism is classified by presentation format into traditional presentations and interactives. This approach focuses on data processing for presentation. This is the last step in data journalism that will help the recipients to understand the data in a very convenient way. Traditional presentation uses written communication, storytelling, and infographics that are expressed in traditional pictures or even animation that is not interactive. In this case, there is no need for a journalist to have programming skills. It takes less time to prepare it than interactive presentations. Yet, even if the presentation is not interactive, it communicates data simply, dynamically, and clearly. While using the format of interactives, recipients of the information can interact with a story. Readers can manipulate data by interacting with the content. This type of visual presentation of data is way more complex and requires good programming skills to prepare. As we have seen, the importance of data and open data journalism is big in today's society, as it provides readers with easier ways to understand a complex information. Yet, there are also some challenges surrounding data journalism. One of the main struggles for open data journalism is that access to data is very limited in some countries. For example, in Southeast Asia, journalists in some countries are having a hard time, especially in the Philippines. Access to government information and assessing the integrity of the information, whether it is fake or misleading data and information, is still a big challenge there. In some countries in the world, there is no freedom of information at all. That makes data journalism even impossible. Yet, the progress is happening. For example, in Malaysia, the new government is drafting its Freedom of Information law and reviewing its open data policies. Therefore, data journalism has a huge opportunity to grow there. Also, in China, where government still limits access to various data, journalists turn to private tech companies to gather data. For example, instead of getting traffic data from the government, journalists get similar data from Didi, the equivalent of Uber in China. Therefore, limited access to data in various countries is still a big challenge to open data journalism, but good journalists find ways how to overcome it. The next big challenge is that local data journalism doesn't develop equally in different parts of the world. In some countries, where data journalism is restricted due to limited access to data, in bigger cities, local data journalism is still making its way because of the willingness of governments to collaborate and share data. That is why there have been many big collaborative open data journalism initiatives in various local communities in countries where open data journalism is still at the beginning of its development. For example, local data journalism in China is much better developed than on its national level. That is because local data is sometimes easier to obtain compared to national data. In some big, highly urbanized cities like Shanghai, the local authority has higher willingness to work with journalists on data sharing rather than in smaller towns. However, in some countries like Cuba, local data journalism is still a challenge. Most journalists there find it hard to cover the local news based on data because all data is national. It is very difficult to get data for local places. This unequal access to data in different areas, even within the same country, makes it harder for open data journalism to develop, and it doesn't create a strong basis. It can even cause some misunderstandings and tensions between journalists and state governments. The next big challenge for data journalism is ethical concerns. The ethical standards of journalism not to break laws, not to lie, use reliable source of information, all apply to data journalism as well. The data is just another source. Therefore, open data journalists sometimes struggle with ethical principles while working with data too. As stealing mail from a mailbox isn't ethically acceptable for journalists, stealing data from a website isn't either. Therefore, before taking and using data from various sources, journalists have to make sure that it is open data and they are free and allowed to access it. Otherwise, they have to ask for permission for using someone's data. And most often, there is a fine line between open data and data published by some private companies which permissions journalists should ask for using it, as it is like any other source of information. Data journalism beginners usually make this mistake. There have been many cases worldwide when data journalists use data without asking the permission for it or even without referencing the source of information. Not only it decreases the credibility of the story, but it can also lead to legal actions. Finally, the last but not least challenge for data journalism is that it is really time-consuming. Recent research about the state of data journalism showed that it is very demanding field for journalists or data scientists to work in. Google News Lab's Data Journalism in 2017 report claimed that data skills are specialized and very time-consuming to develop. The time pressure that exists in the newsrooms also prevents aspiring data journalists from producing the stories they believe need reporting. Instead, they choose ways that are less time-consuming, like regular news reporting, yet these ways are harder for the information recipients to perceive it. As we already discussed, that visual presentation of data is easier processed. Because of its demand for time, data journalism receives less investment from media houses and governments. Data teams are most often the smallest ones in the newsrooms. Yet, as there are many challenges that open data journalism is facing today, the future of this type of journalism looks quite bright, as many data professionals agree. The biggest breakthrough for data journalists has been an access to digital tools. The tools that are becoming more available to journalists have changed this field significantly and expanded its possibilities. 15 years ago, a lot of the things that journalists can do now, such as using simple tools for visualizing data, gathering and managing it, demanded way more time, skills, and knowledge. Only a programmer or someone who is an expert in it could do it in the past. Yet, with modern technologies, more professionals can do it now. This makes data journalism to develop faster and leads to more and more professionals eventually coming to work into the field. Furthermore, many professionals predict that the rise of artificial intelligence will improve the work of data journalists as well. In the majority of cases, data journalists' role is to collect enormous existing datasets and find what's useful to make a story out of them that even hasn't happened yet, but will potentially happen in the future. Artificial intelligence will be used to link together datasets to find stories. One of the Google News initiatives is now building a prototype based on artificial intelligence and machine learning that mines the internet to predict interconnections of global risks that will be at the core of tomorrow's news. AI systems will provide data journalism with enormous help to find data and draw conclusions out of it. It will save a lot of data journalists' time, which is now considered to be one of the biggest challenges in the field, as we discussed in the previous slide. Finally, in an era when the term of fake news is far too common, data journalism is a tool to fight it. Data journalism is a weapon against fake news, with its possibilities to penetrate into and in-depth parts of various reported issues and to back it up by data, numbers, and statistics. Data journalism is slowly but steadily taking over the position of a watchdog that even keeps an eye on how governments are doing. Therefore, as we can see, there is a big potential and a niche for data journalism in the future. To sum up this topic, as The Guardian, a father of data journalism, states, data journalism is 80% of perspiration, 10% of great idea, and 10% of output. Thank you for your attention.